Well, good afternoon and welcome once again to the Committee for Workers International CWI Media Live Broadcast. And of course, today we're going to be focusing on one of the most important international developments for a whole period, and that is, of course, the chaos and the turmoil which has been revealed and taken place in the US presidential elections. But before we get into a discussion on those important developments, we remind our viewers to go to our webpage at socialistworld.net, where you'll find a full analysis and be able to find out how to contact us in different countries. You could follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist. You can like us on our Facebook page, CWI slash Socialist World slash CWI. And of course, you can go to our media channel on CWI Media on YouTube, where we'd encourage you particularly to subscribe to that to help boost our viewing numbers and ratings. Now, of course, for the US, this is an historic turning point, and indeed internationally as well. And today we're very fortunate to be joined by three active comrades from the Independent Socialist Group in the United States. That's Jeff, we have Elizabeth, and we have Claire. So very warm welcome to all three of you, and I'm sure all of our viewers will be eagerly awaiting your comment and take on this historic development. We have an incredible record turnout, which the capitalist press and media are reminding us of. 160 million or thereabouts have voted. It's the highest turnout, I think, percentage-wise for 120 years. Biden comes in with 74 million votes or thereabouts. Trump with about 70 million. But of course, in the US democracy, that is not the end of the story. Because you have the most undemocratic election system that is probably existing anywhere in the advanced capitalist countries, because you still have the hurdle of the Electoral College, but it looks like now it's been confirmed that indeed Biden has come through and has secured a majority there. So in that sense, there's a defeat for Trump. But on the other side, you see these unprecedented scenes of Trump refusing to concede defeat, probably refusing initially to leave the White House. And at the same time, we see amongst a significant layer, of course, of Biden supporters and those opposed to Trump, the celebrations that took place on the streets, which probably indicated a sense of relief for the defeat of Trump amongst that important layer, entirely understandable sense of relief at Trump's defeat. And now you've seen very rapidly Biden moving up a gear, along with the press and the media, to bang the drum for national unity and laying great stress that they have to overcome the divisions. How far they'll be able to do that, maybe we'll explore in the course of our discussions. But many of the capitalist commentators have also been shocked at the size of Trump's vote. And I think maybe that would be a good starting point for our comrades from the US to comment upon. What is the current situation as you see it there now? And how has Trump, after all of this incredible economic devastation, with the horrific health crisis which is rocking US society as well, how has Trump managed to sustain and indeed increase his vote on the last election? So maybe we could start with Jeff, if you'd like to develop any points on the current situation and address some of those points in your remarks.
Well, two things about the current situation that might be a little difficult for people outside of the U.S. to figure out, or even people inside the U.S. in terms of having to go about their real, working lives and trying to figure out what's going on with the elections based on what corporate media is talking about, is that, like most U.S. elections, this was driven by personalities, not policies for the most part, and it was very much focused on Biden's campaign of opposing Trump based on his basic general meanness, general rhetoric that panders to and is sometimes explicitly racist, or giving out sort of bits of sort of right-wing conservative populism on economic issues. And whenever, attacking political opponents in a very personalized way, that sort of thing. And then Biden promoting himself, or the campaign and the Democratic Party promoting Biden as a healer, someone that will not be as abrasive, not be as mean as Trump. and also, of course, attacking Trump on COVID and just without any substantive policy differences, but just saying in terms of the way COVID is being talked about by the Trump administration is damaging, and Biden will take the science seriously. Trump doesn't. So a lot of people would listen to that and did listen to it, and it didn't seem like there was that much of a choice in terms of what really affected them. But billions of dollars were spent in this country every election cycle to make sure there's really only two mass political alternatives, basically corporate political alternatives, parties, electoral machines without memberships, and so on. So when you have that kind of money being spent and that kind of and everything kind of stops, the elections take up all the air in the room. A lot of the progressive and sort of left groupings, even unions, will put everything on hold for the most part if they're allowed to, and just focus on the election. So if all the discontent in U.S. society right now because of the economy, because of COVID, even worsening the economy, in terms of future looking pretty bleak, and all the problems that existed economically in the normal times that Biden talks about going back to, which were not good for most working people. What was the choice on offer here in the U.S.? There wasn't much of a choice. Now, people are desperate, though. People look for a way to say something, to do something, and that's pushed into voting for two corporate politicians from two corporate political electoral machines. And so that vote happened that way. It was really a push for legitimacy, a push for legitimacy of the system in terms of the duopoly, the two-party monopoly, the two-party domination of politics in the U.S., but then right afterwards to legitimize the whole process. And Biden clearly was the choice of the majority of the corporate, the capitalist class. Trump was considered after a certain point too unpredictable, provoking too much anger among progressives and among a lot of people, really. And that anger against Trump was reflected in the vote. But then, as you mentioned, Tony, the surprise, the vote was so close. Well, just take one part of the way the campaign was, what campaigns were conducted, as I mentioned earlier, is that Trump overall threw out a few more crumbs along the lines of economic populism. Just mentioning words like jobs and American jobs, and the economy will be back the way it was, and so on and so forth. And that was enough for some people to hear, oh, that's something about jobs. That's something about the economy getting better. Whereas Biden, most of the time, was only talking about Trump is not fit to be president. Trump is not handling COVID properly. And that didn't really resonate with a lot of people. Now, that's not to minimize Trump's negative message that appeals to some people on racism, anti-immigrant lines, and so on. That's out there. But unless and this is certainly a narrative that's out there, unless every Trump voter is a complete reactionary and a complete racist, then how does the Trump vote make any sense? Well, Biden not offering anything concrete that affects people's lives, except for the fine print. If you go to the Biden website or something, you'll find a few things that are worth supporting, that seem interesting to people. But the experience on the ground for most people is, and a lot of them being in Democratic Party dominated states or cities, is policies that don't seem any different from what the Republicans were putting out there in a concrete sense. But the rhetoric was a little different. Biden emphasizing issues of being, a uniter against COVID more than Trump, although with no specific big policy changes there. And when it got down to the economy, in the second presidential debate, Biden did mention being for $15 an hour minimum wage. That exists in some places in the United States. But the question is, do people believe a mention here and there of economic populism, or in this case, liberal populism, versus Trump mentioning a lot more sort of right-wing or conservative economic populism? That was kind of as concrete as things got, and that was still very vague. Both Trump and Biden sort of saying, we're implying or saying openly, I will do this for the economy. I will change the economy, as if they had a magic wand to make the economy work a certain way without any specifics being offered. So there wasn't much of a choice, but there was a lot of anger, a lot of discontent, and a lot of money spent, a lot of big money spent, a lot of time and energy spent shoring up some sort of voter participation. And also, one other thing, just throw in, and I'll end here, is on this point, is that the voter suppression, mostly attempted by the Republican Party, although the Democrats also did it to the Green Party and have a history of supporting things like gerrymandering and other things that contribute to manipulating the vote a certain way along party lines, along Democratic Republican Party lines. That voter suppression, so obvious from the Trump administration, attacking the Postal Service more than it's already been attacked by both parties, both the corporate parties, but right around the election time and right before, attacking the seemingly to attack, and I think it's true to a certain extent, the right to have the votes counted, obviously, in more recent days, but also attacking the Postal Service, mail-in balloting, and so on. So that just angers some people, and they get out and vote against that. So we can get into more of the reaction maybe later, but I'll stop with that.
Real left workers' alternative have been on offer there, and maybe Elizabeth may have a few comments to amplify any points related to that.
Certainly, yeah. If I can just, pick up where Jeff left off, around, I think, voter suppression. It is true that we have seen a historic vote in this election, but we do have to qualify that. Within the United States, there are roughly 328 million people. Of those 328 million people, only 257 million are of voting age, but you lose at least 17 million people through voter suppression, through gerrymandering, etc. So the voting population, with all those things considered, is around 240 million. So already we're losing, voices, if we want to think of votes as voices, which we obviously find problematic. But that being said, 74 million votes for Biden out of 240 million voting aged people is really only 30% of the total voters. And so while it is true that there is a historic voter turnout, we do have to qualify that it's still not a lot of the U.S. population, and that I think one of the things that we saw this election was votes being driven by fear, through lesser evilism, and I think through some of the rhetoric that the media got going about, Trump staging a civil war and there being a military coup, and we've yet to see those things happen. I personally don't think that they're very likely, especially because right now Trump is working through more legalistic means to challenge the votes. And I think, as Jeff mentioned, that $1,200 COVID payment, that's the first time in my lifetime that the government has given money directly to people. And so I think in that situation, that really, I think, helped solidify some of the vote for Trump. But, in terms of building now, I think as much as there is a relief that Trump has lost, there's also some disappointment that the new president is Biden, because I think a lot of the people who, maybe not a lot of the people, but a good number of the people who voted for Biden did so simply because they didn't want Trump in office anymore. But they do recognize the issues with Biden. And, as Jeff started talking about, Biden criticized Trump's response to COVID. And really, as socialists, we realize that we need, universal health care at the bare minimum to deal with the COVID crisis. And that's just not on offer from Biden at all. In fact, when he was vice president in 2009, he worked with healthcare corporations to cut Medicare and Medicaid payments by $155 billion. That is his record. So he really will not do anything to help alleviate the COVID crisis. So that being said, I think that there is definitely relief from people on the ground. There have been celebrations, but I also think that there are a layer of activists who may have fallen for lesser evilism and voted for Biden, but recognize that there is still organizing that needs to be done, especially around COVID and around economic issues. As we're going into winter, it's becoming clear that COVID's not over. It's surging again, and that will have economic impacts. Especially because this time around, now that it's surging, things aren't being locked down the same way they were the first time. So, for example, I live in Massachusetts. The governor just instituted new COVID restrictions, a curfew, and that you have to wear masks when you're outside, but has done nothing about restaurants, for example, which are super spreaders of COVID in terms of location. So, I think on that aspect, we're going to expect a lot of the same thing from Biden. But to get back to the central question of a working class fight back, I do think that there are a number of groups who are really sick of the two-party system, and a number of individuals who are sick of the two-party system. The majority of voters in the United States are independent. And political parties are not popular, really. There is this sense of political delegitimacy going on. And so I think that, as an organization, we can run with that, and we can work with unions, we can work with community groups to really try and get something off the ground that is an alternative to the two-party system, because really that is one of the most effective ways that we're going to be able to fight the duopoly. And I'll end there.
Of the need for a working class party as an alternative, I mean, it is obviously crucial because you have such a desperate economic and social situation in the US, which is quite devastating in terms of the collapse of living standards that has affected millions of working class people in general. And of course, this brings us to a crucial issue which featured in this election and will come up in the US in future elections as well, and that is the issue of lesser evilism. How do we confront this issue and why has Trump been able to mobilize such a base and expand upon that base? And it's put forward by some on the left, undoubtedly, well, you can't run an independent left candidate because that will split the vote and allow Trump back in. But I mean, the central point is surely the issue is why has Trump been able to get such a base around his party? And is that not really down to the responsibility of the Democrats of what they've done in terms of presiding over attacks on the working class, the whole position, and not offering any alternative whatsoever in a viable base, which has meant they can't eat into his support? And you have the incredible position now, which I'm sure you comment upon, where we've had reports of different senators from the Republicans are now saying the Republican Party is a working class party. I mean, it's incredible position that they're claiming that, and it's classic in the line of right-wing populist parties doing that. So maybe Claire would have some comments to make about this. If you run a left candidate as an independent, are you going to split the vote and be responsible for letting Trump in? And of course, that's a crucial issue.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So that, lesser evilism has been such a struggle for people trying to organize a coherent left in the United States for decades. The two corporate parties and the capitalists who back them bring out all of the tools at their disposal to just drive home this message, including, frankly, the fear mongering that happened in both campaigns this year, right? We saw Biden and Trump both running against this idea of socialism because the mood is there in the United States. It's been growing since the Obama years, actually. It's been growing since the bailout of the banks in 2008, and it's been growing more and more in the in the anti-racist movement, in the the recent corporate bailouts around COVID, the lack of universal healthcare. All of these things are leading to a real mood for change, and so there are both opportunities but challenges for us to organize that in a successful socialist direction, with the fighting methods, and chances to win. And one of those things that we come up against with lesser evilism is exactly the argument that you laid out. And the fact of the matter is, Biden and Obama and the presidents before them, both Democrats and Republicans, laid the stage for Trump, right? Thinking back to 2008, which before this year we thought was one of the worst economic crises that these generations would have. They bailed out the banks. Millions of people lost their homes. That people still have not economically recovered from that before we hit this recent economic crash, right? And so fighting for positive change means ultimately breaking from both the Democrats and the Republicans, whoever is at the head of those parties, because they are ultimately parties of the capitalist class. They won't be able to put forward and enforce policies that can change the conditions for people on the ground, right? People who are being swayed by right-wing ideas, whether it's, the populism that Trump is putting forward, the racism that he's putting forward, pointing fingers at, immigrants or people of color as being the source of your economic problems, when really it is the capitalists who are exploiting us by dividing us along these lines. And so in 4 years, we're going to see Biden laying the basis unless we see a mass movement pressuring him and his administration in the streets, we're going to see him lay the basis for another Trump, right? And so it's our responsibility right now to start organizing the working class to recognize our own power, right? And I think things like political parties come into play because there's an enormous mood, or at least there was over the summer prior to the election really doubling down. There was an enormous mood for change and huge distrust in both of the parties. But because it's unorganized, it's very susceptible to, coming in waves, right? And being either diverted, vote blue, and we'll solve all of your police brutality issues. Same with the economic crisis, same with healthcare, right? And so if we start organizing the working class, we can fight back against the lesser evilism. That's why they're using it. We can organize what is this mood into a fighting movement and into a party. And we can put forward campaigns, including some electoral campaigns, but also electoral campaigns that can pressure whoever's in office, Democrat, Republican, whatever the case may be, to winning change now. And we've seen that in the past, right? We didn't have an independent party at the time, but we saw mass movements, organized mass movements, pressure Nixon and other presidents who were seen as just as bad as Trump in their own times to passing incredibly progressive things. Founding the Environmental Protection Agency, or getting out of Vietnam, or pressuring the Supreme Court to pass the Roe v. Wade decision. So I think we need to make that break with the Democrats, and we can't let this idea of lesser evilism hold us back any longer.
Important point there you've raised, Claire, which maybe we could develop a little bit further. Now, I'd just like to apologise to the viewers because I think we've got a little bit of a sound problem with the Zoom connection from the US at the moment, where the sound is coming through a little bit low. But we're trying to work on that, but it's down to Zoom, a lot of it. But nevertheless, if our viewers can bear with us. But nevertheless, this question of lesser evilism that you came back on a lot there, Claire, is obviously crucial, because the issue of what Trump has been able to build and in effect taken the lion's share of the Republican Party. Now, with the social conditions which exist in the US, that is not simply going to go away. He has a certain base there. whether Trump stays or goes, you've got others waiting in the wings. There's this guy, Tom Cotton, I think, is quite a contender for that, from one of the senators from Arkansas. But there's other contenders there to try and sustain this base. Now, with the social crisis which is there, that means this issue is going to be has to be confronted, and it is the issue then of the urgency of building a new working class alternative to be able to confront these developments in the course of the next years. So I think that that's a crucial point in terms of the urgency of dealing with it. But maybe now to develop that point is, if we can move to the question, is Biden's will assume he's in the White House. He's not quite there yet, but let's assume Trump finally is escorted out in one form or another. What's his presidency going to mean? Because he's coming to power against the background of a massive health crisis, which is not going to go away anytime soon. We have an economic disaster taking place. I mean, just to give one figure, if you take the effect of the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, in 2008, the US economy shrank by 0.1%, 2009 by 2.5%, despite having a 7.5 bounce back after the initial shutdown. It's still contracted by a staggering 4% globally compared to what it was before the onset of the recession. Now, the social consequences of that are going to be devastating. And what is Biden's program for dealing with this position? Maybe Jeff could amplify a few points on that. What are we likely to see from it? And what's going to be the composition of a Biden administration? I mean, we were hearing commentators today traveling into the studio speculating he's going to bring a few Republicans into his administration. What's he really going to be putting on offer?
So Biden talking about bringing Republicans into his administration started actually before the election, and it got a certain amount of corporate media attention, but of course it wasn't stressed, but it was out there. Also, what's really been ramped up in recent days is Biden, and Obama was saying this in reaction to the election, Biden is great about going across the aisle, meaning Biden is great with working with Republicans, basically. That's how they mean that. Across the aisle, of course, implies there's only two parties for as far as the capitalists are concerned. So yeah, there is a history of Biden working with segregationists in the South, like Strom Thurmond. There's a history of Biden with the anti-crime bill, so-called, in 1994, that really accelerated mass incarceration in the United States, of getting a lot of support from Republicans for that, and other policies. Because it's that same basic through line of Democrats and Republicans in terms of substantive issues, often being in agreement, especially in terms of goals. Another thing that Biden signaled was recently that, and this is echoed by many Democratic Party politicians in reaction to the election in the last 24, 48 hours. They are saying that, well, now America can take its place as leader of the world again. In other words, Trump was screwing things up, messing things up for U.S. imperialism and U.S. foreign policy, and from a certain angle, that a lot of the ruling class of the United States saw that and didn't like it, and they're expecting the Biden administration to be more aggressive against China, against Russia, against any perceived threats to U.S. economic interests. And so that is something that could cut across a lot of promises, obviously, that are made by the Biden administration and by the Democrats, which, again, aren't really out there in any concrete form for most people. They're vague promises, and in the past, when vague promises were made, there's no accountability that they will be kept. The Clinton administration, going back a little bit, promised things about single-payer health care, and then did the opposite. Same thing when Obama got the Obama administration, promises about universal health care, and then created a health care plan based on a Republican plan that cemented the relationship and even deepened it between private health insurance companies and the ability to get health care or you go back to Clinton one more time. When Clinton came in, when Obama came in, and even when some Republicans came in, like Reagan at times, there were also celebrations in the streets in certain places, certain quarters. So remember that under the Obama administration, that's when Black Lives Matter started around Ferguson. That was when the first uprising of Black Lives Matter. Remember that Obama not only never brought Employee Free Choice Act, which was a prop for the labor movement, that was never even brought as a bill after promising to do it. And the Clinton example I was starting on was, I was quite active in the socialist movement as part of the CWI when Clinton moved to end welfare as we know it, and that got a lot of so-called bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats. And people were predicting progressives and some on the left mass movements in the streets when Clinton went on that attack on federal social benefits that the Clinton administration wanted to put down to the state level and cut drastically and let the states cut them. And it did really destroy a lot of what little bit existed in social benefits at the time, and the protest didn't materialize. So there's a central dilemma, central contradiction in U.S. progressive and left politics, which it goes like this really quickly. Well, mass movements matter. They're really important. Elections, just go in, pull a lever, doesn't really matter that much. What's missing is the connection between the two, almost completely on the left, or the so-called left in the United States, where they capitulate to lesser evilism around the Democrats election cycle after election cycle, and it never gets to the point of understanding how electoral movements and mass movements, especially in terms of organizing around them, how that builds mass movements on the one hand and builds independent political action or the movement for a workers' party of some sort in the United States. There's a disconnect there. And so they just they just cave into the Democrats every 4 years. And then the argument becomes, well, then there's another election in 2 years, because elections, presidential years and off presidential years. And then, support the Democrats or they're going to get, they won't be in office anymore. So the whole lesser evilism thing is like a virus, basically, in left politics in the United States. And the connection between how building a working class party, a party for working people with progressive and left, programs, how that can help build mass movements and strengthen mass movements. The BLM movement recently was a mass movement, and it was, it was exaggerated a little bit in terms of size, but it was very important, very significant, largely leaderless in a lot of ways, despite the top of the official Black Lives Matter movement being tied to the Democratic Party and liberal politics. It was on the ground. It was a very powerful movement, very multiracial movement with a lot of progressive and left political ideas. And yet, coming up to the election, it was largely buried into supporting the Democratic Party. And if there had been the left really working during the elections, not just supposedly in between, which they never quite get to, because of what I said a moment ago, building independent politics, for example, supporting Hawkins and Walker of the Green Party, who put forward socialist policies, if using elections becomes a way for the left of the United States to organize, even if they can't take presidential power immediately, which isn't really the point in a lot of ways, then the left keeps, in the U.S. keeps, on a revolving wheel of lesser evilism and never getting to the point of building not just electoral power, but mass movements. The two things are combined, they're interlinked. That is not what most left and progressives understand at this point. So what Biden does or doesn't do is based on a mass movement. That's really what it's about. If there's, like Claire mentioned, if there's a mass movement to pressure Biden and the Democrats, then some concessions can be made, some organizing gains can be made. But if the whole electoral component, if the whole building a workers' party part of things is left out or left for the future, and we think there will be pressure to re-energize that movement, and people that we've met and helped organize with in the Hawkins Walker campaign could be one of the ways that a workers' party, movement for workers' party can be built in this when Biden is president. But it's still going to depend a lot on a mass movement and then connecting that mass movement to building a workers' party. And that was put on hold yet again in the lead up to this election.
I think that's a crucial point there you made, Jeff, about the issue of linking the mass movement, the social trade union struggles to the issue of an electoral policy as well, in terms of building a new party. And of course, we need to remember in that situation that the issue of the elections, while they're very important, is episodic. I mean, it's a photo shot of one day, and I mean, it doesn't reflect the whole of the situation that is developing in society, and that is definitely going to be posed now as far as the US is concerned under Biden, because of the depth of the crisis that he's posed there. People celebrating in the streets today in some areas. Okay, it's a sense of relief. How long that's going to last when the Biden administration is put to the test is, of course, another question. Now, a crucial aspect in this movement, this election has taken place following, as you said, Jeff, the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think was crucial, probably had a big impact on the election itself and was a factor. And the whole issue of racism and police brutality is centered as a crucial question. And one of our viewers, Mateus Guilherme, I think from Brazil, and Daniel, have raised an important question here. And that is the issue, what is Biden going to do? He's addressed rhetorically this question because about police brutality and racism. He's putting Harris on his ticket, and they're using that, how they're going to overcome racism, to have a more diverse cabinet maybe. But is he really going to deal with the issue of racism? Is he really going to confront the issue of the racism which exists throughout the American police department in particular? Maybe Elizabeth has a few points maybe to come back on that.
Yeah, thank you. So my first thought on this is no, he really is not going to change systemic racism. And the reason I say that is because systemic racism has economic roots. Like people, that's what makes it systemic. Systemic discrimination is deeply tied to class, is deeply tied to material conditions, and Biden will not touch those. As I mentioned earlier, he's done all these cuts. For 40 years, he's been trying to cut Social Security. He made a deal with Republicans in 2011 to cut spending by $1.4 trillion. He's all about balancing the budget, which just means austerity. And, that's going to hurt minorities, not just racial minorities, but, also the LGBTQ community, women, that's really going to hurt us. And so, you mentioned Harris, and one thing I think that is also at play here in terms of consciousness is identity politics. The idea that, your politics perhaps stem from your identity. So a number of people are celebrating Harris as, the first Black female vice president. But we have to look at what she did when she was in power, because she, as district attorney in California, she did not help Black people. She created this truancy program, which ended up in a lot of criminal charges being brought against Black families or families of color. She loves mass incarceration. She's talked about that before, and about how she recognizes the role that prison labor, really slave labor, if we're talking frankly, plays in the capitalist economy. And so, for example, with the California wildfires that happened this past year, there were prisoners fighting the fires and getting paid nothing or $1 a day for that. And she supports that. So, and Biden and Kamala Harris have also talked extensively about law and order and, cracking down on anarchists, cracking down on the movement. And so they are not a friend of Black Lives Matter. Biden, I think, and the Democratic Party as a whole are portrayed as, progressive when it comes to identities and oppression of these identities. And I think that that's because legally, they don't challenge these identities. They don't challenge gay marriage, for example, in the way that some Republicans might. But crucially, while they may support legalistic equality, they do nothing economically. And so really it doesn't change a whole lot systemically. It's very tokenistic. And so, you know, I think Biden's history of austerity, Kamala Harris's history of law and order and, you know, using the criminal justice system against people of color really is not going to do anything for the Black Lives Matter movement. And as Jeff mentioned, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement started under Obama. A number of movements started after the, you know, I guess honeymoon phase of Obama was over, you know, starting with bailing out the banks. You know, we saw the Occupy movement, we saw Black Lives Matter, we saw Standing Rock. So there were, you know, opportunities for organizing, and there will be opportunities for organizing. I think crucially, though, we have to be aware of these movements trying to be co-opted by the Democratic Party. And, you know, to an extent that includes the progressives within the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders. So, you know, many people were disappointed in Bernie Sanders this summer when during the Black Lives Matter movement, he did not support defunding the police. He actually supported giving them more money for, you know, diversity training, which has been proven to be ineffective. And so, you know, Sanders and the progressives in the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party as a whole are not our allies in this fight because they are a corporate party. They, at the end of the day, they care about capitalism. They care about maintaining profits for the ruling class. And that's inherently, you know, against the interests of the working class. And, you know, what helps them do this are, you know, tools like racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia. And so that will continue under Biden. Just because he won't do anything to change the material conditions. He may, you know, talk the talk, but he will never walk the walk and do these things that would actually challenge systemic oppression.
So that, you know, that's obviously a crucial issue, which is going to feature a lot in, you know, the social upheavals which are impending following the election. Now, you mentioned there the issue of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth, and I think that's an important question. How are they reacting to this? Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, how are they reacting to it? Are they demanding places in the Biden administration? Is it likely that Biden will take them in to try and control them, or how are they likely to respond to this? Maybe Claire has any observations on that important issue.
Yes, as far as I've been able to see, in the last several weeks of the election, Sanders has been pretty much a no-show. If other people have seen otherwise, please come in and discuss. But he has pretty much been a no-show in the election cycle following the Black Lives Matter protests. You know, he ran against Joe Biden and spoke, you know, pretty vehemently against Biden's history and Biden's policies during the early part of the year. And then as soon as he stepped back from the race, it was a huge, yet again, a huge, you know, unity tour, at least as much as can happen, you know, during COVID, not quite the traveling unity tour it was in 2016, but huge efforts, speeches, you know, media, the whole 9 yards about saying, you know, Biden is a good person. I stand behind Biden. I support what he does. So I haven't seen a whole lot since the election has happened. Again, if other people have, please come in. I do know that AOC has been talking about how this you know what, I don't remember it enough to try to describe it here. I wouldn't want to be inaccurate, but I think it goes to show we've been talking about the need to break from the Democrats, and one of the reasons why is even left populists in the Democratic Party, their campaigns and their careers may pick up demands that have been featured in movements outside of the party, the movement for $15 an hour minimum wage, the movement for universal health care. But when push comes to shove, once we're outside of the electoral cycle, they're not doing what they can to help build those movements anymore, right? They're not stepping up as leadership for continuing to organize the quote unquote left wing of the Democratic Party, right? Which we argue is not real. It's a tool for pulling people who might be looking towards independent politics back into the lesser evilism and kind of the reformist hopes of the Democratic Party, where they can be stifled for another 4, 8, 12 years. Yeah, I'll end there.
Well, I mean, they seem to, AOC, you know, in an interview in the New York Times, and indeed Sanders, I think, I mean, they seem to be looking towards the idea, not just of challenging the movement into the Democratic Party, but then themselves going into participating into a Biden administration is what they seem to be hedging. At Sanders, at one point, there was some speculation, I believe, that he wanted, you know, Secretary of State for Labour to try and get involved in that and be part of it, in coalition, presumably, with some Republicans in the administration, not in any way challenging to present an alternative. And in that interview in the New York Times, AOC, incredibly, I mean, it offers no leadership in terms of putting on an alternative, but it was published yesterday. And at the end, she simply said that she's not even certain she wants to remain in politics in terms of running for a Senate seat of the future, that maybe she'd step down from being involved in politics, which is hardly presenting the image of a combative, confident leadership to build any real alternative. So we have to obviously monitor that, but it's obviously a crucial aspect of what can develop here in the next few weeks, the next few months, and we'll expose them further in terms of offering no alternative. Now, Jeff earlier touched upon an important issue, and that is Biden's likely international policy, because Trump, of course, is behind the banner of nationalism and protectionism, has withdrawn from a lot of the international engagement. Biden is saying he's going to re-engage, and as you correctly said, Jeff, he's used these formulations that he wants to put America back into leading the world again, to use his position to try and re-establish the authority or credibility of US imperialism, which I think is largely being damaged further by the antics that have gone on during the course of the election campaign itself. Biden is now proposing they go back into the World Health Organization. They sign up again to the Paris Accord on the environment. And he's also now apparently coming out and saying they want to organize and host a summit for democracy. And he's upped it by saying that they're going to intervene financially to prop up and help the governments in Honduras, El Salvador, as well, in terms of providing them some relief. Said nothing about Cuba, Venezuela, or Bolivia with the recent victory of the MAS there. Now, obviously, this poses an important question because there could be a certain change here, but it's taking place against the background of the decline of US imperialism, the rise of China. Will US have the same authority to intervene internationally, or does it indeed have the same resources to play the role that it has done in the past? So I think that they're important issues that we have to be attentive to. So I don't know if Jeff, if you have any further points you'd like to develop on that important issue of the US foreign policy under Biden.
Sure, thanks, Tony. There was a recent vote in Congress, fairly recent vote in Congress, for increased military spending in a country, of course, that has the most military spending in comparison to any a great more is spent on the military here than in any other country. And in fact, many countries combined, the top military spending countries combined don't even approach the level of military spending in the United States. So recently that passed in Congress, more money to the military here by both parties passed easily. That was before the election, but it was fairly recent. And contrast that with what's happened recently with a secular stimulus package around COVID, as they call it here, which meant, as Elizabeth mentioned, a possible payment directly to people, which is very unusual in a mass way to working people, almost unheard of. And people really could use that money, including me, including us. And that basically didn't happen. There was no second stimulus package before the election. It's debatable whether there'll be one afterwards and what it will contain. So the two parties came together, the two corporate parties came together for military spending. They didn't come together for COVID, for the people for COVID when it was so desperately needed, as the second surge of COVID is happening in the United States and the economic pain continues for most people. So as far as foreign policy goes, the fact that it didn't factor into the election campaigns at all on any recognizable level, on any mass level, in terms of the corporate media, it says a lot. It says where the priorities of the two corporate parties are. It's not at all in, not putting more and more resources into the military. It's not about peace. It's not about, avoiding conflict. It's about the low level of conflict that, relatively speaking, of course, other parts of the world will consider a high level of conflict, but the low level of conflict of the numerous military bases around the world under the Obama administration and continuing under Trump. But it's the rhetoric and the posturing that will change probably drastically under Biden. And like I said earlier, is being welcomed, is being applauded, even in the short time, the 24 hours or 40 hours since Biden was declared. You have prominent Democrats saying this will be great for America to get on top again, to be dominant again. They don't use those exact words necessarily, but that's what they're saying on the world scale in a world situation. And we have to remember that under Clinton and under Clinton administrations and under the Obama administrations, the first 2 years, they controlled all of Congress and the presidency. Nothing happened for working people. But a lot of money continually got poured into war efforts and continuing put into the military. And the idea of cutting the military budget and bringing it back to social benefits, which are extremely weak here, due to the lack of a workers' party of any sort, due to the lack of any mass political alternative to the left of the Democrats and Republicans, social benefits are a disaster here. They're a patchwork of state benefits where they exist at all. And that's been made worse by the deepening recession and by COVID, obviously. So when the two parties, when within the Democratic Party, people like Sanders and AOC, when Sanders conceded to Biden and they rallied around Biden, they had a short period of sort of unity negotiations around issues, supposedly progressive issues from people like Sanders and AOC, from the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party versus Biden and the more conservative wing of the Democratic Party. They got virtually nothing out of that. No Medicare for all, which is the US term now for universal health care. Nothing for a Green New Deal, even the one that AOC helped write, which has a lot of corporate influence baked into it. And nothing on that, nothing on a whole range of, like, for example, forgiving, free college and forgiving student debt. There's some messaging from Biden on that, but no, they didn't really campaign strong on that. It's about affordable college, whatever that means. So put that into the mix for foreign policies related to U.S. imperialism that weren't even part of any kind of negotiation. Biden has a free hand on domestic issues, so to speak, on social benefits, on unions, and so on and so forth. It looks like the Democrats are going to be able to use the excuse of a Senate that still remains Republican, not by a large margin, but the Republicans still will probably control the Senate. So you can see a Biden administration saying on policies to help working people, saying that, well, their hands are tied because the Republicans control the Senate still. And in reality, on issues like Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, China, anything that's labeled a threat to the United States, there will be great agreement. And suddenly the Republicans controlling the Senate will not be a barrier to an aggressive U.S. foreign policy in a lot of ways. Remember, Biden bragged about, I beat the socialists, when he talked about beating Sanders in the Democratic primary. Biden, whenever confronted by Trump or someone representing the Republicans as being sort of soft on issues related to U.S. imperialism and foreign policy, Biden would just up them. He would trump them, no pun intended. He would go further and he would say, hey, we have policies that are going to bring the United States back to its former glory and power, back to normal, quote unquote. And there was a grain of truth in that. Trump was so erratic and self-serving and narcissistic that that foreign policy got distorted, at least on a superficial level, at least from what people could see, to a certain extent. The Democrats, on the other hand, they're less enamored of protectionism, although they use it, than Trump was. They're more into an aggressive foreign policy, and that, of course, has huge impacts on any kind of domestic foreign policy. It's not ruled out at all that, depending again on what's happening on the ground, what's happening with mass movements and so on, for Biden to start some sort of war, or to just say the threat of war means that we have to put all the money available, which is of course they never reveal what's really available or what could be available. We have to put that money to military spending and to our so-called defense spending, and not to any kind of even crumbs based on the promises that were made during this campaign. Also, just by the way, there was a lot of mention. There's a lot of spinning of the election results, and the corporate media, which clearly came out for Biden in this, is basically kind of prodding on where it comes up. It doesn't come up much at all, but where it comes up, prodding on issues like saying, well, what about? I'm sorry, where I was going with that was not there actually is not much about foreign policy. What I meant was in terms of voting, looking at Florida, for example. Oh, there's Venezuelans there in exile. There's Cubans there in exile, and other portions of the Latino vote, and they've experienced socialism, quote unquote, in their countries, and they hate socialism. This was like a theme towards the end of the election in the corporate media, backing the Democrats by and large, and Biden in the latter part of the election campaign. So that is real trouble if the Democrats want a distraction from domestic policies, or they just want to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy and imperialist policy. The groundwork's already been laid for that. The groundwork is set for that, and that could be a big danger that's not being anticipated or talked about much at all, because a lot of like we mentioned earlier, a lot of the progressives, a lot of the so-called left of the United States, once again, bought into lesser evilism and supported the Democratic Party in these elections. And that meant burying any issues about U.S. imperialism or nationalism. And one very last point, nationalism under Trump was very obvious and very kind of, a lot of flag waving, to put it simply. How many flags can they fit behind Trump on a podium? The minute the Democrats did the same thing to a certain extent, to a great extent, and right as soon as the election happened, that was just huge. Nationalism right now is huge in the United States. A lot of progressives, so-called, out on the streets talking about the U.S., very nationalistic terms, waving the flag and so on. And with Biden administration, any kind of lessening of nationalism or xenophobia is not on the cards at all. In fact, it's being used now to legitimize the system. The system works because they finally got somebody elected. They meaning the capitalist class finally got somebody elected, and the system works. And it's a great day for America. That sort of nationalism that Trump used in very negative ways will be used by the Biden administration, of course.
Very important points there, Jeff. I mean, they're obviously going to have an attempt. Biden will have an attempt to try and reassert U.S. imperialist influences internationally, but I mean, it's not going to be a change in policy as far as the tariff situation is concerned. As he said during the election campaign, he's going to be more aggressive towards China and probably towards Russia. You have a potential clash here even with Johnson over the Brexit negotiations in relation to Ireland. Where Biden has made his position clear, and it's going to complicate things further, probably for Johnson here. But so there's many issues here which we've touched on today. There's going to be much more come. It's been absolute turmoil, and we see, I think, this crisis in the US is not simply going to go away because the election has been completed. We're now going to go into a new era under a Biden administration, but a new era of capitalist crisis continuing in the US. There may be a few crumbs given here or there by a Biden administration, but it's not going to resolve the underlying problems. And we're certainly going to see, maybe after a certain pause, but big social upheavals and struggles breaking out in the next period. And as Jeff was just saying, they've used the issue of attacking socialism in this campaign. Now, obviously, they're trying to discredit socialism, but it puts it on the table for a debate about what is socialism being there as well. So I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. There's a lot we have to further develop and come back to. Very briefly, I don't know if Claire or Elizabeth wants to have any concluding remarks in relation to the potential for socialist ideas and the workers' movement developing further in the US in the next months and years ahead.
I can just come in briefly. I think with the celebration that we've seen in the streets around Biden, it hasn't been excitement that Biden and Harris will be assuming the office, but excitement that Trump will be out of office. And we talked about how neither candidate is capable of resolving the crises that are facing, U.S. society, but also the world as a whole right now. So I think, we're dealing with a very explosive situation. I think that for, the next couple of weeks, it might be slow. People might be sighing in relief, might be just happy to get politics out of their news feed and off of their minds briefly. But we are confident that something will happen, whether it's a resurgence in the BLM movement or some twist or turn in the COVID situation or the economic situation. The mass evictions that are on the horizon. As people are unable to afford rent or commercial rent, whatever the case may be. Biden will be shown as incapable, his administration will be shown as incapable of handling it. There will be some sections that say, he doesn't have the full support of Congress, it's the Republicans who are blocking it, but there will be other sections of society who are looking for a real resolution to this, that I think there will be people in the streets at some point, and we have the opportunity to put forward socialist ideas in those movements and to fight for victories. Thanks.
And as well,
Elizabeth, I don't know if you have any concluding remarks.
Yes. So I was just going to say, Black Lives Matter movement is not over. The COVID crisis is not over. The economic crisis is not over. Young people especially are angry. We're angry about the future, or really the lack of future that's available to us, especially regarding, jobs, housing, the environment, which Joe Biden will do nothing for. The American Petroleum Institute congratulated him on winning. He's promised to not ban fracking, et cetera, et cetera. So, as Claire said, there will be opportunities for us to put forward socialist demands and work with people who are seeing through the corporate two-party system, who are seeing through Joe Biden, and Democrat progressivism, which he isn't even a part of, really. And so there will be opportunities for us to put forward socialist demands, to organize with young people, with unions, with the left as a whole, and to work further towards socialism.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Jeff, Elizabeth and Claire for joining us today, which I think has been an extremely informative and revealing discussion about the situation in the US, and points to what potential lies ahead for winning support for socialist ideas. Won't necessarily be an easy or a straightforward road that we have in the next months and years, but nevertheless big upheavals are impending, which will require socialist answers and responses too. So any viewers watching from the United States, if you want to hear more, contact the Independent Socialist Group. If you punch that in to the internet, you'll get their website details. If you want to follow us more from the Committee for Workers International, go onto our website at socialistworld.net. Would appeal to you as well to go on to the YouTube channel, CWI Media, and to subscribe to that. And we'd also like to remind our viewers that while we've been broadcasting fortnightly, we'll now be back in 3 weeks' time, because the weekend after next, the Socialist Party in England and Wales have a very promising and important event, the Socialism 21 weekend, which will include a session on the US where you can hear further speakers. I think Claire and Nick from the US will be introducing a special commission on the US in more detail. So we'd encourage our viewers to go on to the Socialist Party in England and Wales website, where they get more details about socialism there. We'd appeal to all of our viewers who are watching maybe for the first time. Don't remain passive. We need your support financially. Go onto our website and make a donation there. But more importantly, get involved in the struggle. Join us in the Committee for a Workers' International for a socialist alternative to this horrific dystopian era of capitalist decline that we're now witnessing globally. So thanks again for watching, and we'll be back in 3 weeks' time with further comment and analysis of the situation.